Good morning, fifth grade. So over the last couple of days, we've been talking about chapter 8, lesson 4, and different key moments that led to the end of the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started with our timeline. In September of 1862, we have the Battle of Antietam. January of 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. July of 1863, we have the Battle of Gettysburg. 1864, we have Sherman's March to the Sea. In April of 1865, we have Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. In our picture here, we can see, it says in the battle, in October of 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln visited the battlefield. So here's Lincoln on the battlefield. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the Battle of Antietam. And again, just a quick essential question is, how did key moments lead to the end of the Civil War? All right, the Battle of Antietam. In the fall of 1862, a series of Confederate victories in the East put General Robert E. Lee in a position to invade Union territory. Lee hoped that a Southern victory might give the Confederacy the status it needed to be recognized as a nation by European countries. Such recognition could restore the foreign market to the South's cotton. Lee moved his tired but confident troops northward towards Maryland. Unfortunately for Lee, one of his officers lost a copy of the battle plans. A Union officer found the plans and alerted the Union commander, General George McClellan. McClellan prepared a major attack. Lee learned of the lost plans and had time to organize some of his forces for battle. The Union Army was slow to get into position for the attack near Antietam Creek in western Maryland. The Battle of Antietam began on September 17th of 1862. The Union unleashed a massive offensive that nearly succeeded in breaking the Confederate lines. The battle is considered a strategic Union victory. Confederate forces had to retreat to Virginia afterwards, but the defeat could have been much worse for Lee and his soldiers if the Union had attacked sooner. In the end, the Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day of combat in American military history. On the Union side, the number of killed or wounded soldiers exceeded 11,000, and Confederate casualties were more than 9,000. So that's more than 20,000 total soldiers that died in this one-day battle. Continuing on with the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union victory at the Battle of Antietam had an important result. It gave President Lincoln the opportunity to make the focus of the war about ending slavery. The abolitionist movement was putting pressure on him to end slavery. Taking a stand against slavery would also give the Union a military advantage. Anti-slavery nations like Britain and France would be less likely to support the South. As much as these countries wanted the South's cotton, they did not want to oppose a side that had taken a clear stand against slavery. The challenge that Lincoln faced was that the Constitution did not give him the ability to end slavery. Lincoln did not want to go against the Constitution. Also, he did not want to lose the border states where slavery was allowed. So he used one power allowed in the Constitution. This power let the United States seize the property of an enemy nation during war. Since the South considered enslaved people to be property, the Union could set them free. So the Emancipation Proclamation declared that all enslaved people in the Confederacy would be considered free as of January 1st, 1863. It did not apply to the enslaved people in the border states since they were parts of the Union. However, it was clear that if the Union won the war, all slavery would end in the United States. So here is a picture of Abraham Lincoln discussing the Emancipation Proclamation with his cabinet in 1862. So let's go and look at this primary source. And this is, in their words, Abraham Lincoln, and it's from the final draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. That on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. So it's saying that on January 1st of 1863, every person held as a slave in the Confederate territory shall be free. He also goes on to say that any of these free slaves will be received into the armed services of the United States. So saying that these freed slaves are more than welcome to join the Union forces to defeat the Confederate forces. All right, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment. After President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union began to allow African Americans to join the Army. African Americans were eager to join the fight. The Massachusetts 54th Volunteer Infantry Regiment was their first opportunity to do so. Members included two sons of Frederick Douglass. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew created some controversy when he called for free African American men to volunteer for the regiment. Some white people doubted that African Americans were capable of performing as well as soldiers. For officers, Andrews chose white men, mostly abolitionists. These included the commanding officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. As time passed, some African American privates were promoted to officer status based on good performance as soldiers. By May of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts was ready to go. The soldiers paraded through the streets of Boston. Crowds came to see this groundbreaking group of brave men. The regiment then left for the front lines. So here it says it's a recruitment poster for freed African Americans. So it says, to colored men, freedom, protection, pay, and call to military duty. And this here is an African American Civil War memorial. All right. The Union Army was trying to capture the key Confederate port of Charleston, South Carolina. The 54th Massachusetts volunteered to lead an attack on an important fort outside the city, Fort Wagner. Despite heavy losses, the Massachusetts Regiment managed to fight its way into the fort. Colonel Shaw was killed leading the charge. The regiment bravely held the fort for as long as it could. When Confederate reinforcements arrived, the Union soldiers had to retreat. The courage shown by the troops at Fort Wagner made it clear that African American troops could fight just as well as white troops. In fact, Sergeant William H. Carney became the first African American to earn the Medal of Honor, the highest award issued by the military. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans had joined the Union Army. So I want you to stop and think, why was it important for the African Americans to be part of the Union Army? So not only did they get to help fight for their freedom or the freedom of their fellow man, but they also were able to kind of prove, hey, we're just as good as anybody else. So here in this picture, you can see the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment leading the attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in 1863. All right, we have the turning points of the war. Just as in 1862, major victories in Virginia gave Robert E. Lee the confidence to invade the North again in 1863. The Confederates marched through Maryland and entered Pennsylvania. Despite Lee's confidence, his soldiers were in desperate need of fresh supplies to replace worn-out items such as shoes. Confederate soldiers looked for supplies anywhere they could. When one patrol entered the small farming village of Gettysburg looking for shoes, they encountered Union troops. Anticipating a battle, both sides rushed huge numbers of troops into the area. The Union took up a defensive position in hills near the village. So you can see right here in Pennsylvania, we have that Gettysburg right there. Of the war's major battles, Gettysburg took place the furthest north, so in Northern Territory. Okay, and this again is the Battle of Gettysburg resulted in huge losses on both sides. So both the North and the South lost several thousand men. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought over the course of several days, July 1st through July 3rd of 1863. Neither side could claim an easy victory. The Confederate troops repeatedly launched massive assaults against the Union forces. The Union, however, had plenty of reserve troops to answer the attacks. The battle climaxed with what became known as Pickett's Charge. On the third day of fighting, General Lee ordered General George Pickett to charge the middle of the Union formation. Confederate soldiers formed lines about a mile wide and a half a mile deep. More than 12,000 rebel soldiers ran almost 1 mile across an open field. More than 6,000 soldiers were killed or wounded by cannon and rifle fire from the Union Army. Lee was forced to retreat on July the 4th. Gettysburg would be the largest battle of the war. In all, about 51,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in the Battle of Gettysburg. This was the most of any battle ever fought in North America. The Confederacy lost such a large number of troops that it was never again able to invade the North. The Confederates' chances of winning the war took a severe blow, meaning it was going to be a lot harder for the Confederates to even win after they lost so many soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg. Continuing on with the Gettysburg Address. In November of 1863, several months after the Battle of Gettysburg, President Lincoln traveled to the site of the battle. He participated in a ceremony to dedicate a cemetery there. The featured speaker, former Senator Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours describing the famous battle and soldiers' many acts of courage. By contrast, Lincoln spoke for only 3 minutes. He started the speech by saying, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln then said that the people of the Union should honor the dead soldiers by continuing the war and reuniting the nation. He concluded by saying, "Government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth." So here you have Lincoln shown giving the Gettysburg Address, is considered one of the greatest speeches in American history. Moving on to the Battle of Vicksburg. In July of 1863, at the same time as a victory at Gettysburg, the Union won another big victory. The Confederacy had only one fort remaining along the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, Mississippi. If the Union could gain control of this fort, it would have complete control of the river. Texas and other states west of the Mississippi would be cut off from the rest of the Confederate states, badly disrupting supply lines. So here's a picture where it says on July 4th, 1863, Confederate forces surrendered Vicksburg after a long siege. Taking Vicksburg was no easy task, for the fort had huge guns that could easily sink ships passing by along the Mississippi River. But Union General Ulysses S. Grant was up to the challenge. Approaching Vicksburg, Grant tried to attack the fort directly, but the Confederate forces had dug trenches and other elaborate defenses, and Grant suffered heavy losses. Instead of a direct attack, he then laid siege to the fort. To do this, Grant's troops surrounded the area, cutting off outside supplies and support to the fort. On July 4th, the half-starved Confederate forces surrendered. The Battle of Vicksburg had achieved a key step in the Anaconda Plan. Now the Union controlled the entire Mississippi River. Impressed with Grant's military genius, Lincoln brought Grant to Washington, D.C., and made him commander of all Union armies. So again, the Battle of Vicksburg took place right here on the Mississippi River. They were able to surround the fort, cut off supplies, and contribute to that Anaconda Plan, which was that snake-like surrounding the Confederacy and cutting off all their supplies. All right, now leading into the end of the war. With Grant now in the East, General William Tecumseh Sherman was put in charge of the Union armies further west. After Vicksburg, the next Union target was Atlanta, Georgia, one of the South's largest cities and a key railroad junction. To get to Atlanta, General Sherman's troops had to overcome months of stubborn resistance by Confederate forces. Finally, in September of 1864, Sherman captured and burned Atlanta. From Atlanta, Sherman sent his troops on a march to the sea, through Georgia to Savannah, a key Confederate port along the Atlantic Ocean. He and his soldiers were sent to destroy anything of value to the enemy. The 60,000 troops traveled about 300 miles, cutting a 60-mile wide path of destruction. They terrorized the residents and sent waves of fear across the South. They burned crops and buildings. They destroyed railroads and factories. They even killed horses, cows, mules, and pigs. Sherman believed that the North needed to break the South's fighting spirit. So we have battles in the East. In Virginia, General Grant used his larger army to better supplies to try to grind down the Confederate forces of Robert E. Lee. Union forces fought to surround Lee's army outside the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Lee again showed great skill as a general. He fought a clever defensive war. In the region surrounding Richmond, Lee's troops continually dug trenches from which they could defend against Union attacks. Grant stopped attacking and laid siege to the key railroad center of Petersburg outside of Richmond in June 1864. Lee had to defend Petersburg to keep his supply lines open. For months, Grant slowly tightened the pressure on Lee's supplies. The Confederate troops became weak from hunger and illness. That leads us to the surrender at Appomattox. In April of 1865, Union forces took control of the last road and railroad connecting Lee's army to its supplies. Lee had to march his troops out of Petersburg to the west. The Union then cut off Lee's escape route, and Grant moved a mass of troops to confront the Confederates. With his troops trapped with no reinforcements or supplies, Lee realized that he was out of options. Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9th of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Grant offered generous terms. Lee's troops could keep their horses to help with farm work. They would not be charged with treason. Finally, the Civil War was over. The government and historians estimate that between 620,000 to 750,000 died, and about 475,000 were wounded in the war. And so lastly, we have that picture of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, right, surrenders to Union General Ulysses S. Grant on the left in April of 1865.